Sarita, thank you so much for joining us today. And for those that don't know me, I'll do a brief introduction. My name is Elizabeth Cotton. I'm the executive director of a nonprofit called Black TechLink. We're California based. Our mission is to focus on the economic development of Black communities. And we do that through workforce development training, staffing, small business development, and also just working with individuals to help them achieve their career or business goals. And so we've been awarded a generous grant through the state of California Governor's Office of Business Economic Development to start providing export training. And so we're really excited to be joined today by Sarita Jackson from Global Research International Trade, GRIT, to be a part of our program this year. She's actually gonna, in addition to this workshop today, she's gonna be also providing an in-person workshop for small business owners that are interested in developing their export business plan, which should possibly take place in February, late March. And so we're excited to have you today. Sarita, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you for inviting me to join and be a part of this mission, if you will, to continue to promote training as it pertains to exports and particularly for small businesses. As Elizabeth mentioned, I'm the founder CEO of the Global Research Institute of International Trade, and that's our whole focus is providing the education, the training, as well as advising on helping small businesses that are looking to leverage the many global market opportunities, as well as minimize their risk so that they can sell their goods and services internationally and do so successfully. So that's what today's session is all about. It's going to be just an overview to give you a sense of, why exporting, why should we even consider expanding to the global market? Because one of the questions I often get is, well, if I'm doing well here, why do I need to worry about the overseas market? So we will get into that. And then just a very broad overview over the steps that you need to take into consideration before you even start the export process. So we'll go ahead and get started with our slides here. And
Absolutely.
while the slides come up, just so you know, this is going to be engaging. So there will be times where we'll pull the slides down, questions. Elizabeth will come in with questions, or if you have any questions, go ahead, unmute yourself, type it in the chat, so that this can be more engaging than just a lecture for the time that we have. So, all right, so we'll go ahead, get started.
Let me pull this up. Let's see. You see my screen okay?
Yes.
Perfect. All right.
Okay. All right. So as the title indicates, this is about navigating the global market, exporting essentials for small businesses. So we'll go to the next slide. All right. So 8 things that we're going to cover. We will go through them quite quickly. And again, to reiterate, this is more of a conversation than it is a lecture, if you will. So the first part, is why should I even consider going global or exporting or selling my product or service internationally? For one of 2 reasons. It's either if I'm already doing well at home or if I'm getting started, why is this even important for me as a business owner? So that's what we're going to talk about. And just so that you know, some of the stuff I also use that I present here as a small business owner myself. Now I'm in the services sector, but I still export my services overseas. So some of the information, not all, because most of it is geared towards if you're manufacturing a tangible product. Nonetheless, some of this information that I share here is based on how I have been able to expand internationally. Then look at some of the key things, how to assess whether or not you're even ready to export, the important role of market research. Very, very important. I just had a conversation with a colleague in Mexico City yesterday, and this is one of the things we talk about when I talk to my colleagues in different parts of the world, how this very important step of research is often overlooked. So we'll talk about what that means, what it looks like, regulatory compliance, then taking that information to develop a plan and a strategy so that you can move forward. For those that have products, the importance of not just taking your product that's made here in the United States and thinking, oh, it's going to succeed in, say, Europe, but really understanding how to adapt the product for that particular market. And then financing and pricing. And I know that financing is going to be one of the areas where there will be a deeper dive later on, but just to kind of look at some of the options for you to get started, because that's often another challenge that small businesses face is, okay, I'm ready to export, I'm interested, but I don't necessarily have the capital to do so. And then also logistics. So that's what we're going to cover today. All right, so we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so why do companies go global? So one of the things is, and I would like to ask the person on the call if we can just very quickly, if anyone that's on the call, if you're exporting, where are you in the process, or you're here to learn about exporting? I would really be curious. Okay, good. We have, and I see others that are joining us. So for the ones that just joined, the question we're discussing, why do companies go global? In other words, why do they try to sell their products or services overseas? And so I'm just curious as to those that are on the call, if you're already exporting or are you just here to learn about exporting, like to start the process? And you can just type it in the chat if you'd like. Wait, oh, Elizabeth, your mic, you're on mute.
Awesome. I see Anthony and Tatiana, Jen just joined us. If you want to go ahead and share your type of business, sorry. If you want
Yes.
to share the type of business you're in, and just let us know if you are interested in exporting, if you're new to exporting, if you're exporting, if you have exporting experience, if you have a service-based company or a tangible product, as Sarita mentioned, let us know so we can help tailor the conversation to you. We'll give a couple minutes, a minute or so, for you to.
I see Tatiana. Thank you. You're here to learn more about exporting. That's great. Okay, and let's see. Oh, service based. Perfect. Okay. All right. So just so Tatiana, and that this is geared toward just because of the program that under which this falls for manufacturers, but I will talk a lot about services. That's also my area of expertise, and I'll share some resources because that is one area of a sector that gets overlooked, and many of our exporters are services based companies. So I'm able to speak to that from firsthand experience as well. Okay, well, great. Okay, so basically we are here. Oh, you're very welcome. So we're here to learn more about exporting. So we're at the very early stages. So one of the things, or several things, when looking at why companies export is, well, to increase their economies of scale so that they can grow their businesses. And so all of these points that you see on the slide are interconnected. By increasing their economies of scales, also looking at some of the profit opportunities in the international market, increase their market share, increase or lengthen the life cycle of their product. And what that means, for example, I had a client that this was a couple of years ago, now 3 years ago now, 3 years ago, who had a product that worked well in the United States and then kind of wasn't used as much in the United States, and by expanding to other markets, he was able to continue to sell that product, even if the consumer base started to decline here in the United States. He was able to sell to consumers in other markets and untapped international market. So just to put all of this into a quick summary, and we could just kind of stop sharing just for a quick minute just so that it's kind of engaging and you're not just staring at these things. But just to summarize, really, when I talk to companies about why is it that they should export, of course, to increase their revenue. But then as a small business owner, if I'm doing well, just say here in the United States, what more do I need? Because we're often thinking about the risks. The real reason is not just about the increasing of your revenue, it is the stability during times of uncertainty. That's where it becomes very, very important. And when it's those times of uncertainty, that's where you start to feel it, where, oh, okay, let's just take the Great Recession, the 2007 to 2009, where it peaked in 2008. Well, our economy tanked. And you had, because of the housing crisis and different things that were going on, many people that did not no longer have were able to afford a lot of different products, what have you. Well, when you start to lose those consumers, what happens? Then you're losing sales, then you're losing revenue that impacts your business. However, if you are selling to consumers or for our services-based companies, because a lot of that was financial services, right? We saw a lot of rates that went out for, for a myriad of reasons. But let's say if you're a services-based company and you start to lose your clientele. Well, if you have consumers and clients overseas, that can offset the challenges that you are facing at home. And that's the thing that I stress. It's not just about increasing your revenue, but it's maintaining that revenue where you have some sustainability so that when there are times of uncertainty or especially with an economic decline, for example, and you're not sure what's going to happen, well, you can sustain yourself if you know that you have a market that is still at least stable, if not growing in another country. So that's taking those points and summarizing that and driving home why exporting is very useful, especially in today's age, and especially this year, because I know there may be some questions about with the change in our administration and talks about different policies. There's that uncertainty. So again, identifying different markets. Oh, will we learn how to identify that? Yes, we sure will. So at the end, I will do just a quick exhibit, but the in-person, that's where we will do a deeper dive in terms of identifying the right markets. I'll just kind of skim over today because we're covering a lot, but then that in-person session that Elizabeth mentioned earlier, that's where it will be hands-on, interactive on identifying the right market and the market that makes sense for your business. And by February, March, I'll have a clearer idea of where we're going here with our US policy and how to identify the right markets that make sense for your company, your company's resources, as well as, in your case, your particular service. Great. All right, so we'll go back and go to the next slide. Bring our slides back up. Great. Okay. All right, so this is what I was talking about, the firm assessment. Before we even start identifying the right international market, it's very important to really do an honest assessment of your company. This, a lot of times I've seen this with my business, especially when I started out, because I started Grit back in 2013. And it was kind of interesting seeing really small companies where they just say, oh, I'm just going to export because I know someone in another country. And they think that because they know someone, usually a family member or a friend or some personal relationship, that that's the market for them. Not necessarily. I promote having a systematic approach, a focused approach. But before you even start exporting, really understanding, well, do I really have the resources necessary to do so? And that's what this is all about, understanding everything that is involved in the process. But you would do a firm assessment. Do I have the resources? Quite naturally, the capital, the financial resources in order to expand, because what might work here in the United States is going to require a lot more when you're trying to enter another market. Do I have the skills or someone on my team who has the skills and the knowledge? So the two bullet points 2 and 3, I'm combining the skills and the knowledge of what is involved. For example, if I'm going to I do a lot of work with Latin America. So let's say if if I'm working with a client and that client says, hey, I want to go to Latin America or the Spanish speaking Latin American countries, is there someone that speaks Spanish fluently? Those are the types of questions. Or do you have someone on your team that really speaks the language very well and that's adapted to that particular country? Just because you speak Spanish, let's say here in Los Angeles, where I'm located right now in Los Angeles, it may or may not, the context might differ if you're in Mexico City or if you're in, Colombia, other parts of Latin America. So those are some serious types of questions to ask yourself. And then, do I have the knowledge, or is there someone on my team who has the knowledge of the full export process or different components of the export process? So when I say knowledge, understanding the research, understanding what policies are taking place or any changes in policies, someone that understands the financing, the logistics, legal matters. These are some really questions that you should really ask yourself and do an honest assessment. And then also the strengths and weaknesses. Really sit and say, well, what are my strengths or my company's strengths or the strength of my team? And the weaknesses and all that is really just basically sitting down and doing a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Okay. All right. Okay, next. Now, the market research side, this gets to the question about identifying the right markets and the opportunities. So with the market research, that is looking at what are the international trade trends. And this doesn't entail Googling or even Chat GPT or AI. It's really getting deep into what do we see with statistics with our particular product or service for that matter? What are we seeing in terms of with the trade trends, the top markets for this particular product? So if I am doing automobiles, for example, what do we see with regard to the US exports of automobiles? And when I say what are we seeing, what are some of the top markets? I usually look at the top 3 to 5 markets. Number one, what are we seeing over a period of time, not just within the last year? So for 2024, maybe looking at 5 to 10 years to see, are these exports, are these top markets on a consistent basis, or is there a drop, or do we see a decline? What is it that we're seeing? And then taking that information and analyzing it properly so that it makes sense for our business. So at the end, I'm just going to just kind of run through one quick exhibit to give you a taste of what you'll get in the in-person. Okay. Competitors and buyers, that's another thing. Now, you can talk to someone or do a Google search and see what other companies are exporting the same product or service to another market. One of the things that Grit does is we give you a comprehensive list of your competitors. It can be your competitors just from the United States, or it can be competitors globally, looking at what other companies are providing that same product or service to, let's say, the top market. Once we go through the trade trends and we say, okay, Ghana is the right market for my product or service, then you want to see, well, who else is actually exporting to that market, as well as whether it's from the US or from other countries, but also looking at competitors on the ground in that market, so that the more information that you have, the better you can develop a strategy. So the whole point when I do work with clients is to try to minimize blind spots as much as possible. Then also identifying the buyers, that's very important. Now, there are resources out there that will help you to identify where they will reach out to companies and then see, okay, are there companies that are interested in your product or service? That's a good start. but similar to the competitors, also giving you a comprehensive list so that you can get a bigger picture of who's involved, who's in that space, who's actually buying that product, and not just buying, but how often they are buying. Because one of the things when I look at data, oops, I lost my screen here. When I look at data, that sometimes you might say, oh, company X bought this product, but then they haven't done so for the last year. Okay. So to really see who the active buyers are, that's very important. And then the market environment, this just goes to the pestle analysis, looking at what is happening in that market politically, economically, socially, with regard to legal matters, things of that nature, environmental matters. So all of those things are very important when understanding the market and getting that data. Now, I know as small business owners, a lot of times you're focusing on your product or your service. You don't have time to gather all of this data and try, or if you do, to make sense of it. And so that's where, we come in and basically do that work so you can focus on your product or service, then have the right intelligence that makes sense for you so that you can start exporting and export over the long term. Okay, next slide. Okay, so getting deeper into the market research. So these are some key things to think about when we talk about market research. Tariff and non-tariff barriers. So tariffs, we heard a lot about tariffs in the news, not just within the last year, but the last several years now, when we're talking about increase on tariffs on goods coming from different countries into the United States. So it's important to look at tariffs. So what are tariffs? Tariffs are basically a tax that's placed on any good if you are importing, if you're bringing in goods from other countries that you use for your product. These are taxes that are placed on those goods coming from another country into the United States. As an exporter, you still have to look at tariffs, because when you are exporting to another market, when your good is entering another country, there may be tariffs placed on that product. And depending on how high those tariffs are, so let's say I'm just going to be very extreme here, 60% tariff, well, that makes your product less competitive in that market, because sometimes governments will impose high tariffs to protect their local producers. So a lot of times when I'm starting out with, especially smaller companies, as a part of that market research to identify a country to consider as your first export market, or if you're already exporting, as another export market, to look at those markets where there are zero tariffs, meaning that we have some kind of trade agreement, which gets to the policy, the next one, but that we have some kind of agreement with that country that,
I had a quick question.
Oh, okay. Yes.
I know we're talking about products and stuff, but are there sometimes tariffs on like services at all?
Great question. Great question. No, there aren't tariffs on services. It's the regulations, which is that part, the non-tariff barriers. There are usually regulations such as IP, intellectual property regulations. Let's see what other kinds of sometimes a country will have what's called this discriminatory treatment. And what that means is, let's say you're providing a service, telecommunication service, and we have a local provider in our country. Well, then I may make it difficult for you to provide that service so that you do not compete against that local provider. So there are different types of regulations that are put in place. Similar to what I said about, looking for countries where we have an agreement where there aren't any tariffs. These agreements also address those regulations to say, okay, hey, Mexico and Canada, the easiest one to start with, because we have this trade agreement, then you should not discriminate against U.S. service providers. They should be able to access your market and compete in that market. So it's mainly so non-tariff barriers, just think of regulations. Great question. All right, so that's the first point, the tariff, the non-tariff barriers. So your non-tariff barriers. Now, so regulations can also apply to tangible products, but for the service providers, your main concern are the non-tariff barriers, any types of regulations that are put in place that make it difficult for that service to enter that market. Okay. The administration policy, or I'll just speak policy in general. So what are some of the policies in the countries that make it easier or more difficult for you to enter that market? Understanding the demographics in terms of who's going to utilize your service, really understand kind of their mindset. Okay, for example, I'll just take educational services. Educational services, because I've been in that space, or digital services, even just digital, broadly speaking, digital services. That was the thing. Everyone's talking about digital services. Yes, I can provide education utilizing digital platforms to enter. I do a lot of work with developing economy. So let's say developing economy X, right? Well, it's very important. It sounds great. However, it's important to really understand, okay, so who are you aiming for? And then really understanding, do people have access to the internet? How expensive is it? What do they have access to the same tools or resources, digital platforms that we have here in the United States? So you really have to do a deep dive. Now, when I've done work trying to expand overseas, a lot of times it was getting someone on the ground that could provide me with that information. I would say, well, look, I'm going after, let's say, agricultural producers. What are some of the challenges? If I put together this program, will this make sense? And then through your contacts on the ground, then you can kind of get a sense of what some of the challenges are, such as, well, can we really access some of these digital platforms, or is it even really a priority when there are other things that is going on in that market? So that's really important. Political instability or stability, understanding what's happening in a country. And I stress this because I remember when I started my company, I had someone basically said, oh, why should we do market research? Just get the company in a country. And after telling me that or asking that question, she continued to tell me how she had a company in a country in South America where it became very politically unstable, and then that she had to take that client out. And I'm thinking, well, maybe if you had done your research, you would have seen that coming, like really understanding what is happening on the ground and understanding kind of some of the forecasts or things that are likely, very likely to take place, because you don't want to enter a market and then things happen within less than 5 years, and then all of that time, energy, and money, now you have to withdraw. Now, however, if you have other markets, again, going back to that stability kind of thing, diversify, if you will, so that if, let's say, you have to withdraw from that market, you still have some other markets where you're selling your product or service. However, since many of us are on the call, you're starting out, you don't want to start out with a country where, okay, there are things brewing, and then within a year there's some kind of political outbreak or what have you, or social unrest, and then you're not able to sustain any kind of constraints, which ties into what I was saying earlier with technology. That's usually what I see, where I will see, and I've seen this actually, uh, where companies or individuals will go to a market and then say, oh, I'll wait back until I get back to the United States, start emailing, and not take into account, well, we take for granted our email and all of our technology here, but it may be more expensive, not as frequent in other markets. So to really take that into account. Exchange rate, any kind of currency exchange. For example, a couple of years ago, I remember, and I put this on my YouTube channel, where the US dollar was very, very strong. Well, guess what? When our dollar is strong, it sounds great, but then our products are more expensive overseas. So that's something to think about with regard to our exchange rate and how it compares to the particular market, because your product may be more, or service may be more expensive going to another market, or, depending on, or it could be less expensive. I encountered that with the strong dollar trust. So I know that very well firsthand when I was going to certain markets, and then it was just, I mean, it was just way too expensive. So I had to look at some other markets. Any norms, what are, understanding what the traditional customs or what the norms are in that market's very important. The environment, which can go, one of two ways, just understanding the social environment, the political environment, as I talked about, the legal environment, regulatory environment, better said, economic environment, or depending on your product, if you're doing something that deals with kind of the natural environment, understanding how your product may have an impact on that natural environment. So that can be defined in so many different ways depending on your product, or your service. And then culture is very important, understanding the culture and cultures within culture, because you may find that in a country that, you have a business culture, and then the culture, is it more of a family oriented culture, or individualistic cultures? So, and there's a whole literature on that to understand the different types of cultures in different regions, or the different cultures within the same country. Okay, so those are some things with your market research. Okay, before we move on, I just want to just take a quick break, see if anyone had any questions about anything else on this slide. Okay, all right. Okay, we can continue.
Yeah, as you know, we're waiting to hear from the audience. I just think about like last year, a year or two ago during the pandemic, our
Mm-hmm.
organization, where like as an organization, we provide educational services as well, through our youth STEM and robotics program. And someone requested for us to do our youth STEM and robotics program in Zambia, Africa. And so, we did some virtual sessions where they brought groups of girls into like the American spaces in Zambia, and we were running into an issue where they were unable to access like certain websites, like the Esri website. We teach GIS, and they were
Yes.
unable to
Uh-huh.
access that. And so like that was like one of the constraints that we had. And so I just thought that was interesting that you pointed that out. It's like because
Yeah.
we didn't necessarily do that market research where I forget what it's called specifically, but where certain like websites aren't like able to be accessed in different countries.
Right. Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. Because as you were sharing that, I was thinking about a conversation I had with someone from East Africa about this, where he was saying, that a lot of times you have the companies or organizations that come and they're promoting all this digital stuff, and he's like, but we can't do anything with it.
Yeah.
Your case was more so accessing, because sometimes, yeah, you have to make sure that whatever the website or the platform, that it is allowed in that country. And in his case, he's like, this was agriculture. We're still just trying to deal with the basics of just being
Mhm.
able to, understand how do we make sure we increase our crop yield, make sure that we don't waste our food, all of these post-harvest laws, make sure we don't lose food, have the proper refrigeration. And so then in his case, he was saying, I mean, he gets it, but they're just not there yet, because they're still just trying to deal with some traditional methods. And so I'm so glad that you shared that, because during the pandemic, only from speaking with different individuals from, different regions of the African continent, and hearing that quite a bit, it's like, okay, it's, yes, we get it, but at the same time, it may not, you have to kind of meet people where they are and really understand that. So, yeah, I appreciate you sharing that story. Okay. All right. Okay, regulatory compliance. Yes, absolutely. I deal with this a lot more so. Just my firsthand experience when companies are trying to bring in goods into the United States. Nevertheless, this is still very important, understanding when you're trying to export to other markets. And then for the question about services, you see that it's mentioned at the bottom as well. It goes back to the question about do tariffs apply to services? And I responded that not the tariffs per se, but non-tariff, which gets to the regulations. So depending on your particular product, it is very important to understand the regulations in that market. This is just an overview. You would have to look at that particular export market and understand what are the requirements as it pertains to food and beverages. Yeah, is it regulated? 9 times out of 10 it is, because they're trying to make sure that any goods that are coming in, food or for anything for human consumption, that it's safe for the population. So it's very important and I will say, because some of this does entail working with a customs broker. So I'm kind of connecting resources to this. I'm just going to type in the chat here because I definitely want everyone to know. Customs broker. Okay, I'll just stick with customs broker. We won't get to freight forwarding just yet. A licensed customs broker can help you. Do not do this on your own. A licensed customs broker will help you understand the regulations, or sometimes an international trade attorney. Okay. Invest the resources. When we talk about costs, incorporate this as a part of really an investment in the process to understand, what do I need to know about any food, any standards that are set for that food going into that market. For example, a lot of times, like our beef here in the United States it has difficulty accessing other markets because we use hormones or whatever that's not used mainly throughout Europe in that market. So it's very important. Fish. I remember when I was working on a project with a small business owner in the Caribbean region, and she was trying to get her fish to Europe. Well, if you need to know, well, what are the requirements with regard to, in that case, mercury? Do you have the proper testing, things of that nature, so that you can show that your food, in this case fish, is safe to enter that market and meets the guidelines? So those are things to know. Beverage, to really look at what is going on in that market. And what I put in the chat, that's a way to get started. And make sure you deal with someone that really understands that market. Not just, oh, I'm a customs broker, I'm an international trade attorney. But if you're saying, hey, I want to go to Mexico or Japan or whatever, that they definitely know what the regulations are for that market. Cosmetics, a lot of times you also have regulations for that. So to really do an assessment of your product and understand what the regulations are, if there's any testing requirement, documentation, whatever is required, so that you can access that market. Plants, same thing. A lot of times you have regulations with regard to plants to make sure that once they enter a market, that they're not going to be harmful in that market. And then for services, any kind of regulations. And a lot of times, as I mentioned earlier, it can come down to things such as intellectual property, other kind of legal requirements for your service entering that market. Now, with the services, that's where an international trade attorney or a market researcher like myself is because the services is a tad bit easier to just say, well, this is what you need to know for your service entering that particular market. Okay, can go to the next slide. So step 4. So we've gotten through assessing, really doing an honest assessment and asking the question, or doing the assessment that will help us to answer the question, am I really ready to export? Then doing that market research to understand the market, looking at some of the regulations that we need to consider if applicable. Now we take all of that information and develop a plan and a strategy. So the process is basically what we're going through right now. Start from market research all the way to the point of actually exporting that good or service. Okay. And then the market entry strategy is what comes next. So the process is, okay, this is the plan, what I need to know from doing my research, to understanding the regulations, to logistics, logistics, mainly for tangible goods. For services, whatever I need to know to get my service into that market, if I'm going to do everything virtually, etc., to get into that market. That's your process. And then your market entry strategy, you build your strategy based off of understanding everything involved in that process, not just the steps, but the costs involved in that process or the investment. I prefer to use the investment that you need to make so that you can export successfully. Okay, and then that's where working with an advisor to develop the plan and the strategy that makes sense for your company, and not just the company, but also your product or your service. Okay, next slide.
Yeah, and I'd like to mention again that Sarita will be advising and providing hopefully that service February or March for new to export companies that are interested in exporting.
Okay, product adaptation. And I will also talk about service. I can speak on this, but just quickly with product, it's just make sure that your product fits whatever specifications are necessary for that market, such as your packaging, your labeling, any kind of features. So we all know with the plugs, that whatever you use to plug in and charge up your computer or any kind of electronic products here in the United States, sometimes, that you travel somewhere, the outlets are completely different. So you have to make sure that your product, that's an example of product features. The outlets are so different. So you need to be aware of what are some of the differences in another market or the size of a product that may work here in the United States. Well, do you need to make any kind of adjustments to the size in that market, especially when you're talking about something that goes in people's homes? So these are all things that, and I'm just giving you a very broad overview here. But again, just so that you know what you need to take into consideration, and this is a part of the research, what are some of the things that you need to know about that product so that it is adaptable in that market? And then again, the language and the culture, the way that a product is used and understood in that market. And the same with the service. So with the product, it's how you deliver that product or how that product is presented in another market. And the same with the service, how it is delivered in another market. For example, I'll just say, kind of with education, from an educational side, like really understanding who your audience is, because you may need to change the way that it is presented or delivered the information to that particular audience. And so that gets into, well, what is kind of the mindset? How do they think? How does that audience behave? Right. For example, when with education, dealing with people from different parts of the world, where you might be more exciting and how do you say, more animated with certain certain demographics, and others where maybe that might not work. So really taking into consideration who you're targeting with your particular service, and then also with your marketing. This gets into marketing, a part of your strategy. Uh, Different colors, how it's worded, all of these things you need to take into consideration, even with your service, your website too. Does your website really speak to that community? And are there any adjustments that you need to make that may be different from your US audience? Okay. Right, we can go to the next slide. Okay, financing and pricing. Yes. Okay, so this is another a key area, even though it's mentioned as step 6, but it is very important because this is where a lot of businesses, not just small businesses, but just businesses, if you don't sit down and really look at, do I have the financial resources? If I don't, where do I get the financial resources? What are how will I determine my pricing going into a market? And sometimes that is based on how much it's costing you to develop your product, or even develop your service for that matter. So these are just some things to think about. Landed cost. What are the costs, especially for the products? This is more for the tangible goods. If I am manufacturing a good, it's not just about the cost going into manufacturing that product, but the whole process along the supply chain to getting your product to that particular market, your shipping costs, insurance, all of these different things that you need to take into consideration. Sit down with the licensed customs broker, and I'm going to put here also a freight forwarder. Okay. Because there are documents that you need to fill out if you're shipping goods, and be aware of, well, some of those documents, there are costs with completing those documents to get your good into another market. So it's really important to work with these individuals or researchers such as myself, as well as these additional resources that I've listed in the chat, so that you can have uh, as detailed of an analysis as possible, so that you do not find out, because I've seen this again, going back to when I started my company, you don't start swimming and realize you can't swim. And you're almost to the deep end or halfway through, and then have to come back. So get all of that information up front, and then that's where you can plan and prepare so that you can export successfully. Tariffs, we've talked about, those are things to think about in terms of the impact on your good if you're exporting. So are there high tariffs? I use the rate, just an extremely high rate, just for the sake of an example, 60%. Hopefully you're not going to a market that has that high of a rate. It should be a lot lower. But to understand what that means for your product's ability to compete. Now, the tariffs on the cost side is if you are importing. So you can still export a product, but you might, there can be someone on the call where you are importing a product, importing inputs, I should say, inputs for your final product. Well, that adds to your cost. Where you're sourcing those inputs, from where you're sourcing those inputs, and if there are tariff rates, what those tariff rates, if they're not at zero where we have an agreement, then what are those tariff rates, and how does that factor into the cost of not just producing that good, but the whole import-export process? The non-tariff measures that we talked about, any kind of regulations that make it difficult to enter a particular market, and that does add to the cost. One of the things, as I mentioned, when I talk to companies, when they're looking to identify a market, I said the best place to start are those countries where we have a trade agreement, because then it reduces those tariffs or eliminates the tariffs, but then also any other kind of measures, any kinds of quotas, which are some quantitative restrictions on how much a good can enter, or any regulations, they are minimized. So that is something to take into account, because that affects your cost of production, or on the other end, once you get into that market, the cost to the consumer or the client, to the consumer, yeah, and the client, that may make your product or service less competitive. And then the export financing. And I'm going to ask Elizabeth if she could just put in the link to the STEP grant, which is a way to start to get some financing solely for exports. The STEP grant, which is offered by the state of California, I don't remember the whole schedule, but she'll put the link and all the information is there, which is a grant for, well, really a voucher for small business exporters for export related activities. For example, if you want to go to a trade show, translate your website, and whatever other activities that are listed on that link as eligible activities, that you can apply and see if you're eligible for that financing. But I mentioned that it's a voucher because you still have to pay upfront, and then you will be reimbursed. So all of those details will be put in the chat about the STEP grant, and then other financing opportunities that are available through the Small Business Administration. And so I'm sure this is going to be covered, the Small Business Administration, where they have export financing programs for small businesses.
Yeah, actually, our next workshop next week focuses on financing options for exporting, where we will have a speaker from SBA, from California STEP Grant, and the Export Import Bank. So they'll be
Great.
talking about financing opportunities for interested exporters.
Great. Okay. So there you go. So and
I'll put
I
the
saw
link
that.
in the chat for people to register for that one, but they'll be providing like a plethora of information. And you guys can, speak directly to the people that manage those programs. And I know that there's some programs specifically for minority entrepreneurs that exporters can benefit from.
Excellent. Yeah, I saw that. So I was like, that's a good segue for next week. Yeah, because I mean that's the main thing that with businesses in general, quite frankly, I mean I know we're just talking about small businesses, but just businesses, you can talk about export all you want, but if you don't necessarily have the financing and these resources, then it's just going to be, well, we know that we should export. So this is definitely great for the Small Business Administration. So for those of you on the call, I definitely encourage you, please go next week because you can ask your question. They're going to talk about, you've got the STEP grant, as Elizabeth mentioned, someone to talk about that. But then even the SBA has their different programs for international, specifically for international trade, and then the Exim Bank, where they will talk about their export credit insurance, the working capital program. So there's so many different programs. So I would just leave that for next week, but so many different options, just starting with the STEP grant, but the options that each organization has that you should definitely leverage. Okay. All right. Let's see. I think we're, 2 more steps. Okay. All right. Then the next step, logistics and distribution. I'm just going to go through this. I will leave this for the logistics experts. Uh, so that's where the licensed customs broker that I put in the chat and your freight forwarders, they are here to help you with the whole shipping process, what you need, understanding the costs to ship, any kind of insurance, whatever you need for shipping that product, any kind of your terms of sale, Incoterms. So you're going to have logistics people. So they're going to talk about Incoterms, which are the terms of sale, meaning how you negotiate with the buyer to determine who is responsible for what along that shipping process, including insurance. So I will leave that to the logistics experts, but this is some of what's involved for those that have tangible products. Customs, if there are any additional taxes or things like that, getting your product through customs. The documentation, I mentioned when we were looking at the costs, I said about the documentation, really making sure that you know what documents are required and that you fill them out correctly. It is not the freight forwarder's responsibility to make sure that your documents are accurate. That is your responsibility. So if something goes wrong, it's coming back on you. And what I mean by that with your documentation, do you understand your tariffs? Make sure that you are able to classify your product correctly. So this gets into harmonized tariff schedules. Oh, this is going to get too technical. So if anyone needs to stop me and ask me to slow down or elaborate on something, please do. I'm typing something in. Just let me know because I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible. So harmonized tariff schedules are for those that have tangible goods, not for the service providers. How you classify your product. That's for you to work with your licensed customs broker to make sure you classify your product correctly. Then to determine the proper tariff rates, describing your product. That's what some of the documentation. How do you describe your product? What are the contents, the measurements, weight, blah, blah, blah. All of that stuff that goes into the documentation to determine the proper tariff rates when you are getting your goods into that market and any additional taxes or things that need to be paid getting into that market. So those are some things, working with the licensed customs broker, your freight forwarder for any documentation. For example, in that I do a lot with Mexico and companies that are that want to take advantage of our trade agreement with between US, Mexico, and Canada. You have what's called a certificate of origin. And a question that I often get is, oh, if let's say if I'm making product X and I'm sourcing from China, can I bring it through Mexico and get it into the US and pay no tariffs? No, you can't do that. The certificate of origin is designed for you to specify what percentage of that product was manufactured in a territory in Mexico, the United States, or Canada. So let's just stick with US and Mexico for the sake of the example. What percentage of that was manufactured in the United States and Mexico? If it's the 51% or whatever the rule is, what's called rule of origin, whatever that rule is as it pertains to that particular product, you have to meet that and you have to show that. Then you have a certificate of origin verifying that. And the reason being is because it is to discourage companies from bringing in goods from other markets, because it's benefiting those economies, right? It's benefiting the industries, the producers, and the other economies that are not party to this agreement, bringing in goods, then trying to bring it through Mexico, and then enjoy the 0% duty rates. Okay, I hope that was clear. So that's where you have that kind of documentation. That was okay, good.
No, I'm
Yeah,
glad
so
you brought that up because I used to work for a freight forwarder for a couple of them. And just, it's all aligned when you're talking about documentation. And I just remember like one of the things that we used to ship was pharmaceutical products. And I think one of the shippers forgot the certificates of origin. And yeah, it was just held up in
yeah,
customs for a while. And those days add up too. Like you said, it's not the freight forwarder's responsibility. So every day that it's like at the warehouse, at the port, waiting to be shipped off, there is a hefty fee that is
yeah,
associated with it. Yeah. So thank you.
yeah. Yeah, no, I appreciate you. Yeah, chiming in with those real life examples. Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, it's the fees that you pay. So as I tell clients, I remember someone was like, "Oh, can I figure out the harmonized tariff schedule myself, or the tariff code, I should say, the tariff code, classify the product myself, and do all this myself?" I said, "Well, I mean, I can't stop you. However, it would be better to invest in doing it right the first time than to have all these fees on the back end. It defeats the purpose,
Yeah.
right? And then, like you said, they're very hefty. So these are some things to really think about and work closely with your customs broker, your freight forwarder for those shipping goods. And then you have to get that information. Again, I stress, it's not their responsibility. At the end of the day, it's you. It's your company on all of those documents. So it's up to you to do the right thing and understand what the right thing is. Because if any mistake, it can be very costly. The same with the warehousing to, find providers. Now we have a 3PL, 4PL, where you're incorporating a number of services, not just I'm storing your product. So to work with companies to identify the right warehousing companies, whatever your needs are. So all of these different things are a part of the logistics side for those that are shipping goods, and then to incorporate when you're looking at what are the costs, how much do I need to have to invest in this process.
Wonderful. And just to chime in on that, I know after the export financing workshop that we have next week, following that, we have a workshop called Ship, Road, Rail, and Beyond, which focuses on intermodal logistics for to help small businesses identify like, well, what's the best way to get my product from point A to point B. And so we'll talk a lot about logistics and distribution during that conversation, which is January 23rd.
Okay. All right, then I think our final step. Oh, no, that was the final step. Okay, so that's it. So there's my contact information. feel free to reach out. I'll also put in my LinkedIn, but we can open it up. I would love to make this even more of a conversation. I would love to hear, especially from Tatiana, about the type of service that you provide and any questions I can answer. I see Jaden on here as well. Anything that I can answer specific to what it is that you do. And in the
Yeah,
meantime,
I will,
oh, go
let's
ahead. I'm
see.
just pulling up I'm going to add my LinkedIn. We can connect and then, yeah. And then I can tailor my responses, answer direct questions that pertains specifically to them. All right. Okay.
Okay, I invited Tatiana and Jayton into the chat to provide any feedback, any
Yeah.
questions they may have. Tatiana, you guys are in the panel, so feel free to ask any questions. Well, while they're thinking of their questions, I have questions, as we're looking for like opportunities to provide services. Like how familiar are you with like international development banks? And I
Oh,
know a lot of
yeah.
like international companies utilize uh development banks to post like requisitions or services or products that they need within their country. And so I just want to get your feedback on that.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to only because we're on services, great question. So I'll hold off if anyone's with products, I can do the sample on how to identify markets. But for services, great question. I'm very familiar with it. So with the development banks, because that was, when I say that I got involved with exporting, it was all services. So when I moved back to LA and people were talking about shipping, I'm like, what? But I could talk about services. I'm like, I don't move physical goods. I mean, I understand it. I have to. But from the services, that's what I do. And not just the educational services from consulting. So when I talk to service providers and on how to get the financing instead of I'm trying to and actually I did work with a client that was doing this, trying to export a service to Mexico, and we're meeting and all these meetings and nothing's coming out of it, and he's using his personal savings. I said, well, I mean, this is an engineering, this is a very, and what you're doing is very important related to the environment. Why aren't you on any of these projects? So with the development bank, like you said, the World Bank, I did a lot of this when I was in the Washington, D.C. area. So I kind of lived internationally on the East Coast before moving back to Los Angeles to start my company. And that's how we provided a service, was bidding on these contracts. Now that was a small consulting firm, okay? So we didn't have to be the primary consulting firm on on those contracts. We were the subcontractors and we had our niche. So our niche was international trade. The projects were economic development, broadly speaking. So that includes so many components. And then with us, because we had our niche when it came to international trade, and I was on that technical team, we would subcontract and go after bid on contracts offered by the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, there's the African Development Bank. I didn't work on any of those projects, but just to throw that out there. And then also you've got the U.S. Agency for International Development. You have the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, USTDA. So when I work with the service providers, that's the area that I really build, not just, go after the STEP grant, but how can you get on projects? And then, you get paid. That's the key thing. I've seen service providers, I don't know, they go to a market and then they come back, I didn't get paid. But when you're on these projects, you're going to get paid while you are able to still provide your service overseas. And those services, professional services, consulting, educational services, architectural services, now digital services, more so, accounting, legal services. And I'm so glad you asked that question, because a lot of times when I talk about this, it's well, see how you could provide accounting or legal services overseas. I said, yeah, there's so many projects that's funded so that you can do that. If you're trying to go on your own, it might not work. I don't know, so it just might be more challenging. But where they do, and like I mentioned earlier, I deal a lot with developing economies. So they may have a legal infrastructure, or the government is saying, well, we're trying to improve our legal institutions. Well, then through these projects that are funded, not you trying to do it by yourself, and you may or may not get paid, then you can provide legal advice or whatever it is that project. So yeah, absolutely. So I totally can help on that. And then putting together a successful bid, how to work with other companies. Don't just try to, especially if you're small, don't try to do it yourself. See, now you got me off on a tangent because I've seen so many things.
I love this. No, because it's definitely going to be a segue for programming that we have coming up
Yeah.
later this year. We are partnering with the organization called Black Entrepreneurs, Leaders, and Learners. They have
Okay.
a government contracting and certification summit. And, in
Right.
partnership with this grant that we have with GoBiz, I definitely want to work with them to bring in some conversations that focus on global contracting and how
Right.
small businesses can become involved in that and start exporting their services in that type of capacity instead of, as you mentioned, like going off and trying to find like clients themselves.
Right. And they can, just to get it started, because I'm sure they'll come up with the sam.gov. And, that's a website to get started to find some of those opportunities. And the one thing, please let me stress, is during the pandemic, I saw this where here we go. Service provider, someone came to me and he sent me this long proposal, sent it to a government organization and said, oh, I never heard back. I said, well, first of all, did they ask for it? No, but I had a great conversation, these conversations. And I said, do you realize you've just given away your intellectual property? Like, they might use that to develop a program and not even bring you on. So please don't do that. I've seen so many, and I hear that. I don't know why people do that, but that's kind of my pet peeve, where they come up with all this stuff and then they just send it off and then it doesn't go anywhere. It's like, no, there is a whole process that you follow. Now there may be some way where if you have an original idea, which there is, then you can propose that, but you don't just send that off. And again, that's your intellectual property. I mean, it was very detailed. So I definitely recommend, please start with sam.gov, and then there are other databases and platforms for procurement opportunities, global procurement opportunities, where it brings all of the opportunities from these different agencies. So you're not going one by one, all of the agencies under one umbrella. Start that way, network, get with some of the larger companies, because the larger companies are going to be the prime on these projects, right? And then subcontract, build your experience that way until your company gets to the point where you can be a prime contractor, meaning you're the main contractor, you're leading that project. That's the way to go about doing it. It saves you money. You're not using your personal savings. And in this case, a retirement, you are the funds are there. There's a whole process of negotiating the budget. That's a whole different conversation. But at the end of the day, you know that the funding is there. It's many of the contracts are, multi-year contracts. So that's good if you're on a project for 5 years, that's sustainable for your company. And then you're able to provide the resources, hire people if you don't already have them on board, contractors or what have you, to provide that service overseas. And then you will get paid.
No,
So if you
thank
need
you
to
for.
bring me in on that, yeah, that's why,
Oh
like, I
yeah.
love, that's my
I'm-
area.
Okay, I think Jaden is on the call. He kind of manages that conference, and so I'll
Cool. Okay. I
definitely
hope he agrees with what
definitely.
I've said. Go through it. Just go through a proper channel. That's the main point.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay. Tatiana, Jayton, did you have any questions, comments?
Hi. No, this is really great information. Yeah, I would definitely would love for you to be at the conference. It's in San Diego, so I don't know where you're at, but
Is that
yeah.
what date was it again? The 23rd?
Yeah, the 27th and 28th. That's a Friday and a
Oh,
Saturday.
okay.
And
I can make, I mean, because I'm going to be in San Diego on the 22nd, but yeah, totally. I'll just block off that time because I'm right here in LA. It's not far. So I would love to join.
Awesome. Awesome.
Let me make a note. January 27th.
Yeah.
27th
in
and
June,
28th? Oh,
June.
June.
Yeah, June, not this month.
Oh, did I
My
hear
bad.
January? Oh, okay. I did hear January. I was like, wait, no. Okay, June. I'll mark that. Okay,
Yeah,
June
yeah.
27th and 28th, or just the 27th?
It's the 27th and the 28th. So,
And
yeah,
San
so we
Diego.
have so usually how our summit goes is the first day we say, meet the buyers, right? So you get to talk to the administration from like the county, the city,
Yeah.
and things of that nature, how you can do business. And a lot of it
Oh,
is obviously based in San Diego, but then at
yeah.
the same time, we're opening it up to, it's not just San Diego doing government contracts, right? So we've
Yeah.
had, people come down from LA, from Long Beach and other places just because, they want to get that knowledge because it's not really out there like, a conversation like today. So so the Friday is more focused on that, and then Saturday is more about like the day-to-day business people, right? So the ones who have a business and just trying to figure out like what are some skill sets, some ways for them to just grow their business because either they're starting off or they've been in business since the
Uh-huh.
pandemic or just started their business last year or something. So we have a wide range of people that attend this summit. So the topic that we're on like right now is we're trying to broaden it out because okay, besides local and federal, what can you do globally, and
Right.
that's the
Okay.
part that we haven't touched on. And that's why I came to come on. I was like, man, you know what, this import export, I know Elizabeth keeps talking about this import export stuff. I'm like, what is really the process? And now hearing your presentation, even though I got on kind of late, I'm like, oh my
Uh,
gosh, this is a process. You really are pretty much starting a business doing the process, so that's just
Yeah.
my 2 cents on that. Mhm.
Absolutely. And I tell even new to export, or even if someone's just starting a business, I always advise them, why not start building your global business plan into your business plan from day one?
Mhm.
Just think globally. I do have a question for you. So, for the summit, as you're looking from the global perspective, so then, and I think this is what you were alluding to, Elizabeth, that you're trying to bring people in on how to bid. Like, that will that focus on bidding, grant writing, because that's what
Yeah,
people really need.
Yep.
That I've seen. Cool.
yeah. From what I've seen in the past, conferences or the summits, I've seen, as Jayden mentioned, people from local, state government agencies talk about the bid process.
Uh-huh.
So I think as we're partnering with them in regards to like our export programming, I think it would be great to talk about what does that global bid process look like? And the goal is to really educate and help small businesses and nonprofits like build their capacity to be able to become subcontractors, prime contractors, on these on different projects, whether it's the school district, whether it's a city, county, state level. um I know I've seen like the state and city and county represented. And so this year, I think it would be great to have maybe some people from the federal government come and talk about um, contracting opportunities, ways that small business kids can start, bidding on federal contracts. Even though you did mention SAN.gov, there are a lot of nuances and
Right.
intricacies
Exactly.
of on that. So we have experts come and kind of help demystify like what some of those steps are. And definitely as we have federal level, we would love, to have conversations about what is it like global bidding look like? Who are the main
Mm-hmm.
players? Where do we begin to look? What does the bidding process look like? What does networking look like in that space? So,
Right.
yeah.
Great. Yeah, no, you're really addressing the right areas. Because that, and as I think about the example of the person that was spending his own money, including retirement, it's like, oh no, these contract, like the contract he went after was $1 million, but it was trying to provide this information just the way that you mentioned of who are the key players, so you know who to connect with to bid on these projects together. The networking, how do you network, who do you network with, and then just like you said, there are so many intricacies just to go through the bidding process itself and what you need to know. So no, I think that's excellent. So I will mark that, check my calendar, because I would like to just kind of sit in on that and
And just
see,
even recently, like our organization, since we started doing, like I mentioned before, that we did some educational programs in Zambia, and my colleagues in Zambia reached out to me and told me, hey, uh, President Biden just signed into act the libido agreement between Congo, um, Zambia, and Angola to help build those the infrastructure in those
yeah.
regions. And so I'm just like, as a small business myself, I'm like, where do I even begin to possibly provide my services, like bid on those projects? Like, where do I even begin? And so I
Hmm.
think a lot of people have questions, that want to go the government or the contracting route. Like, where do they even begin, to
Hmm.
be able to enter into these markets through a contracting like avenue or pathway.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
So and I wanted to see if Tatiana had anything. I would be interested in the specific type of service and if there are any additional questions. Something. Okay, maybe not.
She may not be available, but we'll
Yeah.
definitely ping her back. I
Yeah.
think for her registration, she provides web development services. And
Oh,
so
oh, okay. All right. And I'm sure we'll connect. Yeah, and like you mentioned earlier, I'm here for any, technical assistance. And I would be interested, you're going to be sending out a poll later on, because I would be interested in some feedback just on the information provided today.
wonderful. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, I'll be sending out the like a poll for the people that attended today. I know we had another person, they had to jump off. And then I'll also be sending out this recording to people that were unable to make it, and they can watch this video on demand. Um, so yeah, I'm really excited, and I look forward to working with you in the near future.
Yes.
Forward to the upcoming workshop next week. As I mentioned before, it's export or financing options for exporting. And so
Okay.
that will be a good conversation. We have a lot more conversations coming up focused on exporting this year. And we're still working on the date, but Sarita will be in person in San Diego. For those that need support developing their export business plan, she'll be working directly with small business owners that need a little bit support or some direction on how to build their export business plan. So I'm looking forward to that as well.
Okay. Great. All
And
right. And they
then
have my
just
info. I'll just put my
I'm
email.
going to
I
share
know it
the
was
share right here.
okay. Great. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so everyone screenshot this. Reach out to Sarita. She's a really great resource. You just have any questions, or need any support, she's there for you. And so, Sarita, again, I really thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Look forward to the in person and continuing to work with you.